This is the last reading concerning Chinese history. We talked about the Temple of Heaven. The temple was located in the capital city of Beijing. It is one of the most significant historical structures in all of China. It is built in 1420 at the order of the Ming Dynasty emperor. It was a sign of the emperor's annual appeal to heaven for a good harvest. In this important ceremony, the emperor demonstrated to his subjects that he was their protector and would ward off the evil forces in nature. The temple burned to the ground in the year 1889, but it was immediately rebuilt following the original design. The period between the Tang and the Ming dynasties was in many ways the great age of achievement in Chinese literature and art. Other dynasties were more known for their technology. Enriched by Buddhist and Taoist images and themes, Chinese poetry and painting reached the pinnacle of their creativity. Porcelain emerged as the highest form of Chinese ceramics, and sculpture flourished under the influence of styles imported from India and Central Asia. The development of Chinese literature was stimulated by two technological innovations: the invention of paper during the Han Dynasty and the invention of woodblock printing during the Tang Dynasty. And at first, paper was used for clothing, wrapping material, toilet tissue, and even armor, but by the 1st century BCE, it was being used for writing as well. In the 7th century CE, the Chinese developed the technique of carving an entire page of text into a wooden block, inking it, and then pressing it onto a sheet of paper. Ordinarily, a text was printed on a long sheet of paper like a scroll. Then the paper was folded and stitched together to form a book. The earliest printed book known today is a Buddhist text published in the year 868 CE. And so we're talking about the 9th century there. It is more than 16 feet long. Although the Chinese eventually developed movable type as well, block printing continued to be used until relatively modern times because of the large number of Chinese characters needed to produce a lengthy text. Even with printing, books were made too expensive for most Chinese, but they did help popularize all forms of literary writing among the educated elite. Although literature was primarily a male occupation, a few women achieved prominence as a result of their creative prowess. During the post-Han era, historical writing and essays continued to be favorite forms of literary activity. Each dynasty produced an official dynastic history of its predecessor to elucidate sober maxims about the qualities of good and evil in human nature, and local gazetters added to the general knowledge about the various regions. Encyclopedias brought together in a single location information and documents about all aspects of Chinese life. And it is important to notice this since many people today take it for granted. The importance of poetry. It was poetry above all that separated the Chinese dynasty of the Ming from the Tang, and of course most effectively expressed their literary talents. Chinese poems celebrated the beauty of nature, the changes of the seasons, and the joys of friendship and drink. Others expressed sorrow at the brevity of life, old age, and parting. Given the frequency of imperial banishment and the requirement that officials serve away from their home district, it is little wonder that separation was an important theme. Love poems existed, but were neither as intense as Western verse nor as sensual as Indian poetry. The nature of the Chinese language imposed certain characteristics on Chinese poetry, the first being compactness. The most popular form were 4-line and 8-line poems with 5 or 7 words in each line. Because Chinese grammar does not rely on case or gender and makes no distinction between verb tenses, 5-character Chinese poems were not only brief but often cryptic and ambiguous. 2 8th century Tang poets, Li Bo, sometimes known as Li Bai or Li Taibo, and Du Fu or Tu Fu, symbolized the genius of the era as well as the two most popular styles. Li Bo was a free spirit. His writing often centered on nature and shifted easily between moods of revelry and melancholy. One of his best-known poems is Drinking Alone in Moonlight. Among the flowers, with a jug of wine, I drink all alone, no one to share. Raising my cup, I welcome the moon, and my shadow joins us, making a threesome. Alas, the moon won't take part in the drinking, and my shadow just does whatever I do. But I am friends for a while with the moon and my shadow. Where Li Bo was a carefree Taoist, Du Fu was a sober Confucian. His poems often dealt with historical issues or ethical themes. befitting a scholar official living during the chaotic times of the late Tang dynasty. Many of his works reflect a concern with social injustice and the plight of the unfortunate, rarely to be found in the writings of his contemporaries. Neither the poetry nor the prose of the great writers of the Tang and Song dynasties was written for or even reached the majority of the Chinese population. The millions of Chinese peasants and artisans living in rural villages and market towns acquired their knowledge of Chinese history, Confucian moralisms, and even Buddhist scripture from stories, plays, songs passed down by storytellers, wandering minstrels, and itinerant monks in which a rich oral tradition, given that most people during this time were not literate. Of course, one exception is the popular poem Song of Lasting Pain by the Tang poet Bu Juyi. Of course, Bu Juyi lived from 772 to 846, whose poignant portrayal of the emperor's constant yang resonates among Chinese readers down to the present day. Popular culture. By the time of the Song dynasty, China had 60 million people, 1 million in Hangzhou. Along with the growth of Chinese cities came an increased demand for popular entertainment. Although the Tang dynasty had imposed a curfew on urban residents, the Song dynasty did not. The city gates and bridges were closed at dark, but food stalls and entertainment continued throughout the night. At fairgrounds throughout the year, one could find comedians, musicians, fencers, boxers, wrestlers, acrobats, puppets, and marionettes, shadow plays, and especially storytellers. Many of these arts had come from India centuries before and were now the favorite form of amusement of the Chinese people. The Chinese novel also appeared during this time. During the Yuan dynasty, new forms of literary creativity, including popular theater and the novel, began to appear. The two most famous novels were Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Tale of the Marshes. The former had been told orally for centuries, appearing finally in written form during the Song as a script book for storytellers. It was first printed in 1321, so about the early 14th century, but was not published for mass consumption until the early 16th century. Each new edition was altered in some way, making the final edition a composite effort of generations of the Chinese imagination. The plot recounts the power struggle that took place among competing groups after the fall of the Han dynasty. Packed with court intrigues, descriptions of peasant life, and crippling battles, Romance of the Three Kingdoms stands as a magnificent epic, China's counterpart to the Mahabharata. Tales of the Marshes is an often violent tale of outlaw heroes who, at the end of the Northern Song dynasty, banded together to oppose government taxes and official oppression. They robbed those in power in order to share with the poor. Tale of the Marshes is the first prose fiction that describes the daily ordeal of ordinary Chinese people in their own language. Unlike the picturesque novel in the West, Tale of the Marshes does not limit itself to the exploits of one hero, offering instead 108 different storylines. This multitude of plots is a natural outgrowth of the tradition of the professional storyteller, who attempts to keep the audience's attention by recounting as many adventures as the market will bear. Concerning art, although painting flourished in China under the Han and reached a level of artistic excellence under the Tang, little remains from those periods, as we have seen in our earlier readings. The painting of the Song and the Yuan, however, is considered the apogee of painting in traditional China. Like literature, Chinese painting found part of its inspiration in Buddhist and Taoist sources. Some of the best surviving examples of the Tang period are the Buddhist wall paintings in the caves at Dunhuang in Central Asia. These paintings were commissioned by Buddhist merchants who stopped at Dunhuang, and then, while awaiting permission to enter China, wished to give thanks for surviving the rigors of the Silk Roads. The entrances to the caves were filled with stones after the 10th century, when Muslim zealots began to destroy Buddhist images throughout Central Asia and have only recently been uncovered. Like the few surviving Tang scroll paintings, these wall paintings display a love of color and refinement that are reminiscent of styles in India and Persia. Taoism ultimately had a greater influence than Buddhism on Chinese painting. For early times, Chinese artists removed themselves to the mountains to write and paint and find the Tao in nature. In the 5th century, one Chinese painter told to travel began to paint mountain scenes from memory and announced that depicting nature could function as a substitute for contemplating nature itself. Painting, he said, could be the means of realizing the Tao. And this also explains in part the emphasis on nature in traditional Chinese painting. The word for landscape in Chinese means mountain water, and the Taoist search for balance between earth and water, hard and soft, yang and yin, is at play in the tradition of Chinese painting. To enhance the effect, poems were added to the paintings, underscoring the fusion of the visual and the verbal in Chinese art. Many artists were proficient in both media, the poem inspiring the painting, and vice versa. To represent the totality of nature, Chinese artists attempted to reveal the quintessential forms of the landscape. Rather than depicting the actual realistic shape of a specific mountain, they tried to portray the idea of a mountain. Empty spaces were left in the paintings because the Taoist vision, one cannot know the whole truth. Taoist influence was also evident in the tendency to portray human beings as insignificant in the midst of nature. In contrast to the focus of the human body and personality in Western art, Chinese art presented people as tiny figures, fishing in a small boat, meditating on a cliff, or wandering up a hillside trail, coexisting with but not dominating nature. The Chinese displayed their paintings on long scrolls of silk or paper that were attached to a wooden cylindrical bar at the bottom. Varying in length from 3 to 20 feet, the paintings were unfolded slowly so that the eye could enjoy each segment, one after the other, beginning at the bottom with the water or a village, and moving upward into the hills to the mountain peaks in the sky. By the 10th century, Chinese painters began to eliminate color from their paintings, preferring the challenge of capturing the distilled essence of the landscape in washes of black ink on white silk. Borrowing from calligraphy, now a sophisticated and revered art, they emphasized the brushstroke and created black and white landscapes characterized by a gravity of mood and dominated by overpowering mountains. Other artists turned towards more expressionist and experimental painting. These so-called literati artists were scholars and administrators, highly educated and adept at music, poetry, and painting. Being scholars first and artists second, however, they believed that the purpose of painting was not representation, but expression. No longer did painters wish to evoke the feeling of wandering in nature. Instead, they tried to reveal to the viewer their own mind and feelings. Like many Western painters, the 19th and 20th centuries respectively, many of these artists were misunderstood by the public and painted only for themselves and one another. Second, only to painting and creativity, was the field of ceramics, notably the manufacture of porcelain. Many of fine clay baked at unusually high temperatures in a kiln. Porcelain was first introduced during the period after the fall of the Han and became popular during the Tang. During the Song, porcelain came into its own. Most renowned, perhaps, are the celadons in a delicate gray-green, but Song artists also excelled in other colors and techniques. As in painting, Song's delicacy and grace contrasted with the bold and often crude styles were popular under the Tang. The translucency of Chinese porcelain resulted from a technique that did not reach Europe until the 18th century, and during the Yuan and the Ming, new styles appeared. Most notable is the cobalt blue and white porcelain, usually identified with the Ming Dynasty, which actually originated during the Yuan. The Ming also produced a multicolored porcelain, often in green, yellow, and red, covered with exotic designs. And so we have finished our chronology of medieval China from the 1st century all the way to the end of the Ming Dynasty in 1644. Next we will cover early Japan, early Korea, and early Vietnam, the two dragons being Japan and Korea, and the smaller dragons being Vietnam. And then we're going to start with Japan, the land of the rising sun, a gift from the gods in prehistoric Japan.